Okay. Welcome to Zibby's. Thank you so much for coming. We're super, super excited for this event. I'll hand it over to you both in a second. But I do want to say we have a new sort of incentive for events now, which is if you sign up on our Eventbrite and then come here, we'll do a little raffle for a free book for each event. So if you did sign up for our Eventbrite, just make sure you check in. I know we got a couple check-ins, but we'll pull the name at the end of the event. So I'll hand it over to you guys. Cool. Thank you so much for being here, and make sure to come buy books at the end.
Okay, awesome. I feel like I should just go over a little bit who we are and also how we know each other, because I feel like it is apparent pretty immediately that we know each other. And this wasn't some randomly assigned thing by our publishers. But so I am Rufi Thorpe, and this is Simone Gorrindo, and The Wives is her debut memoir. But we met actually at a California State Summer School of the Arts when I was 15 and she was 16. And we were randomly assigned suite mates. And it was like really one of those like movie things. Like I was never the same again after that summer. That summer wound up changing our whole lives. Yeah. And we met the group of people that we then, so I decided I didn't want to go to high school anymore. And I was like, Simone, I wrote her a paper letter. This was the late 90s. I wrote her a paper letter and I was like, you should just apply to college with me and not go to high school anymore. And she did. Oh. And we both got in and we moved to New York City together when we were 16 and 17. And then 2 weeks later, 9/11 happened, and that was insane. And so we lived together in New York City, yes. And like we both.
And I tried to move in with my boyfriend, but then we broke up, and
so she moved right back onto my couch. It was amazing. I was so happy. I was like, yeah, it's all coming together. Get rid of that guy. But so it is this really special moment. I'm a novelist. Mm-hmm. I've never written a memoir, and I would never be brave enough to write one. But to have, I've known that she was brilliant since we were 15, and they didn't give you like, I feel like I need to give you like a proper introduction, but I don't even like know your bio.
It's Simone Gorrindo.
Hold on. But it's impressive. It's impressive. Listen, Simone Gorrindo's writing has appeared in the New York Times, New York Magazine, Long Reads, Los Angeles Review of Books, the Christian Science Monitor, the Best Women's Travel Writing, and other publications. She holds an MS in journalism from Columbia University and has received fellowships and grants for her writing and reporting from the International Women's Media Foundation, the Georgia Council of the Arts, and the Hambridge Center of Creative Arts and Sciences. She lives in Tacoma, Washington with her husband and 2 children. And The Wives is her first book. I've known that she was a voice of our generation since I was 15. And now I get to do this event with her and see the world discover her voice and the way that things look through her eyes. And it's like, it's a moment for me. So I am so honored to be getting to have this in conversation with you today. This is the dream for me.
I don't even know what to say after that introduction. I feel like anything that's going to come out of my mouth is going to be a disappointment. That was such an incredible.
Well, so my plan was, so we meet, right? We have summer camp. We then go to college early. And then will you just take us through like a Cliff's Notes version of your life so you can understand where does this book fall? What period of your life does this book cover, and where does it fall in the trajectory of your life?
Okay. So, right. We moved to New York City together. And except for a short detour, I stayed there until I was 28. And in my early 20s, my now husband and I moved in together. He was my boyfriend. And he, had grown up on a hippie commune. Neither one of us had a military background. And he just said one day while we were out walking, sometimes I think about joining the military. And I just said, I would leave you. And it just came out of my mouth, and just the same way it came out of his, except I think he'd been thinking about his statement for a long time, and mine was very knee-jerk reaction. And he didn't say anything about it for the next 2 years because I said that so strongly. And I think a lot of it was I was from a pacifistic background, and also the image of the army wife to me was somebody who was alone and left at home and waiting. And having my life kind of controlled by the whims of the army. And that was not something I envisioned for myself. So 2 years later, though, it became very clear that this was a conviction and a calling and something that he was not going to give up on. So I eventually went along for the ride, and we moved. We spent a year apart while he went through initial training. We got married in a New York City courthouse, and he left 9 days later for boot camp. And then we got stationed in Columbus, Georgia, and I moved from New York City to Georgia. And 2 weeks later, he deployed to Afghanistan. And I was such a city girl, I didn't even have a driver's license. So for all intents and purposes, I was kind of marooned in, a strange land. And that is right where this book starts
Yeah. So
and
since
covers that
that's where
period of
it-
time.
Will you read just like the first like 3 or 4 pages of the opening so that we get a taste of like your voice
Of
and
course.
what that initial moment that the book starts in?
Sure. Okay. Part 1. I'd rather live in his world than live without him in mine. Midnight train to Georgia. Chapter 1. A rapidly deployable combat unit. November 2012, Columbus, Georgia. In the photo Andrew had texted, the little brick house looked out of another time. Just call me June Cleaver, I'd captioned the shot when I'd sent it to my oldest friend, Raina. In person, though, the 1940s home looked more like it had been forgotten entirely. The front lawn patchy, no shrubs or flowers bordering the foundation, not even a small porch to sit on. I hadn't realized that I'd hoped for these things, but I'd lost an apartment next to a reliable subway line in the only city I'd ever loved. A porch swing would have softened the blow. Maybe we should have gone with base housing? I asked Andrew, who was standing next to me on our new driveway in the dusk. I didn't have a driver's license, had never had a need for one in New York City, so he'd driven all 1,000 miles here. Over the course of 2 days, we'd had 6 hours of sleep and lukewarm showers at a Motel 6 in Southern Virginia, but he looked untouched by exhaustion, his dark hair combed perfectly into place. Trust me, at my rank, it would have been worse, he said, rolling up the back door of our U-Haul. Plus, this place is $700 a month. We get to pocket a little of that BAH. He looked at me with a mischievous grin, the evening light catching the flecks of gold in his green eyes, and I felt a surge of excitement. We were going to live in a house. We had never lived in a house before. The Army issued you a basic allowance for housing to cover rent and utilities, calculating the amount allotted by looking at the cost of living in your area, your rank, and whether you had any dependents. Ours was $1,100 a month. After utilities, we probably wouldn't be pocketing much. Still, I could not get over this number, $700. That had been my rent for a basement bedroom in Brooklyn when I was 21. My view had been a brick wall. I wish we could leave this stuff out here for the night, but I don't think it's a great idea, Andrew said, looking around. Getting off the freeway, the roads we'd driven had been lined with used car lots and fast food restaurants. Then, when we got close to our street, a neighborhood park had appeared like an oasis, shaded by tall oaks, maples, and southern pines. The old homes bordering it were in good shape, even stately, but they had become smaller and more run down as we'd driven up the hill toward ours. We were just 2 houses in from an intersection, after which the neighborhood dissolved into a wasteland of empty lots and old warehouses. Among them was a small clapboard church with an old marquee in front, one of its letters gone. SIN space ERS, are welcome. Oh, look, I said to Andrew, pointing. They knew the New York heretics were coming. He laughed as he picked up a box. I grabbed it from him and turned away from the truck. There was a woman standing at the end of our driveway. She looked about my age, late 20s, thin and freckled, her face red as though she'd been out all day in the wind. She wasn't wearing a speck of makeup. Her long chestnut hair looked dry at the ends, like it needed a cut. Let me get that, she said, rushing toward me and grabbing the box from my arms. I'm Rachel. It's so nice to meet you. Can we help you unpack? The words trailed after her, rushed and breathy, as she walked up to our front door and placed the box on the stoop. It was like she had been waiting for us. Maybe we should let them get settled in, babe, said a guy standing at the curb. Rachel was so excessively friendly, so overwhelmingly there, I hadn't even registered him until now. I looked over at Andrew. A smile was spreading across his face. This had to be Boyd. Or Daniel, as Rachel introduced him now, rejoining him at the end of the driveway, her hand curled around his forearm in a way that was both tender and possessive. Wisps of blonde hair peeked out from under his Mets cap. Dan, he gently corrected, and shook my hand. There was something old-fashioned about Dan, or Daniel, or Boyd, with his ruddy complexion, white sneakers, and big, toothy smile. Andrew had met him at Fort Benning, the Army base 10 miles from our new house, at a selection process for an elite, rapidly deployable combat unit that was part of the Army's special operations. After they'd made it in, both of them had gotten stationed here, and when Dan found the nearly identical brick house across the street from ours, he told Andrew about our place. The landlord, a plumber named Frank, had bought both for cheap during the height of the recession. Theirs was nicer, I noted, with some jealousy. It had a covered porch, some well-kept bushes, a feeling of having been recently loved. That was where June Cleaver actually lived.
So will you just take us through and give us a sense of what that initial adjustment period was like?
Okay.
Like, you're coming from San Francisco. Like, how was it different? How,
Well, New York.
Well, New York, but I mean,
But also
ultimately you
San
were raised San
Francisco.
Francisco. Your cultural background is not small town Georgia, and you're thrown together.
Right.
It
was, it felt a bit like a small town, but it really actually was a mid-sized city, though, people have read the whole book, still will call it a small town because comparing it to a place like San Francisco or New York, it felt quiet and quite small. And I think that was at first the most just like visceral transition was in New York. You walk out your door and you're just like assaulted by humanity. And I would sit and look out my window and just like wait for a human being to walk by, especially because, 2 weeks later he deployed to Afghanistan. So I was really, really on my own. And the quiet was oppressive in the beginning. And I, looking back, don't know what I would have done had I not met Rachel, had this woman not shown up. Because she comes back after that scene with cookies. And I'm just kind of like, wow, she's aggressively friendly. and she was so sweet. And Andrew's like, well, you should be friends. And I'm thinking, well, I don't know. Like, I felt like a very unlikely army wife. I was like, all we're going to have in common is our husbands, which means maybe we won't have anything in common. And then we drove to the drop off for deployment together and, saw each other cry, but knew nothing about each other. So it's kind of like we had this really rushed, forced moment of intimacy. And then it took a few days, and eventually she reached out to me and said, do you want to come over for wine at night? And I went over there, and we did have a lot of differences in that she'd been raised in a very religious household. Her faith, she's Christian, her faith's really important to her, and I had not been. And in other ways, it was like we were aligned. We both voted blue. There were some things that were sort of a lovely surprise, but more than that, we didn't really talk about any of that. We ended up talking about things like when Andrew and I were engaged, and we went to couples therapy, and he said, if I have to choose between you and the army, it's the army. And I told her things like that I generally did not tell anybody. And so it was definitely, I think, just because of this pressurized situation where we didn't have anyone else, we got very, very close very quickly. And, later in the book, her in particular, I spent so many nights at her house, the app on my phone, the Maps app, started registering it as home. And then also, I also came to know a whole group of wives, and all of us were really radically different from each other. But yeah, the beginning was tough. I mean, there were things like going down to the grocery store and, old men picking up boxes of Cheerios with pistols on their hip. And like, I had never experienced that. In some ways, I was really kind of provincial, like in that I had grown up on the coasts and not seen the rest of the country. And, also had grown up in a family that was pretty much anti-military, definitely anti-guns. Definitely, we were not, NRA members in the slightest. And that was the beginning. I mean, seeing somebody at the grocery store like that was just the beginning. It's going to barbecues and seeing guns on top of refrigerators and in kitchen doors. And I mean, just like part of the fabric of life. And then also religion was hugely important in Georgia in a way that it hadn't been in the community that I was in New York. And that was hard. I mean, because the question wasn't, do you go to church? It was, what church do you go to? And it was hard because I didn't have a church. I mean, there were times that I really wished I did. And later on, there were times that I actually became an honorary member of Rachel's church group. And nobody was ever like, do you believe in God or where do you go to church? They just welcomed me and I had dinner with them. And So there were challenges about the transition, but there were also like really kind of incredible surprises like that church group that I became a part of.
Well, and I think my next question was sort of like, will you sketch out, even though it may feel painfully obvious to you? I mean, this book it's called The Wives, not My Year as an Army Wife. Like the sort of A plot is about your relationship with these women, and the B plot is your marriage. And just how do you like spell it out for people why these relationships become so important with this group of women, like the ways in which you would rely on each other,
right,
and the ways in which like you were, and specifically like maybe you can talk a little bit about the ways that the Army, the kinds of messaging that they were doing for you guys about how to be a good wife. What does it mean to be a good Army wife, Simone?
So the first, oh gosh, I have so many answers, and but the first experience I had with that kind of messaging, well, the first was very immediate. When they went to Afghanistan, I was getting emails from the company commander's wife saying things like, leave no trace behind, which basically means like, do not write on social media about anything where your husband is. Do not tell your family when he's leaving. Don't say anything to anyone, basically. And so, they called themselves quiet professionals, and we were very much told to be just as quiet. And that was really I think our main role was to be silent. And that is one of the reasons we became as close as we did, because it was kind of with each other that we could share the secret of our lives and feel seen and just talk about really mundane daily stuff. So, even just like, what time are they getting in? I mean, just stuff that we couldn't even talk about with their parents or our own parents or our kids. So, there was that aspect of it. And then there was also like, we went to a spouse retreat after I went over to Rachel's house to have the wine, and the spouse retreat, I was like, isn't that run by chaplains? And she's like, well, they're not going to preach to you. And I said, okay. So we went, and nobody did preach to us, but there was a pastor's wife, and her entire talk was kind of billed as self-care, but it ended up being about kind of like, when your husband gets home, you should really have lipstick on and have your hair done. And that was we got all kinds of different messages as time went on. That was the most shockingly like 1950s message I ever got. But definitely there was a kind of message of, like, keep it together and don't fall apart. And you are like this anchor that is running. I mean, they still say things to us like, they can do what they do because of you, because they're going back and forth in his unit at such like a breakneck pace that you are kind of relied upon as this gravitational force. And at the same time, you're also kind of invisible and not given lip service, but not given a lot of support, I would say. And so that support ends up existing in the form of these friendships. And, I would say that the friendships, in some ways, it's like I'm closer to people I've been friends with forever. But at the same time, I went through things with these women, like we'd go to each other's OB appointments, or, get each other from the emergency room after car accidents, or go grocery shopping together, or call each other after there had been a casualty overseas. And so you're kind of going through that dailiness of life that you go through with family or with your spouse. Like, you're kind of practicing marriage together in a way, or installing each other's air conditioners, or that, that kind of stuff, which is its own unique kind of intimacy that is really, I came to value hugely during that time, and value now, like somebody who shows up really more than any other quality in a friend, I would say. I feel like I just gave you like 8 answers.
No, well, I asked you 8 questions.
You kind of,
so it's fair.
It's kind of your fault.
Fair.
Okay.
So at what point in your time, like when did you, because I know that when you first were going down there, you mentioned to me like, oh, maybe I'll write a novel about this experience.
Yeah. Good
but
memory.
then it didn't. I mean, I think then you were in it, and you were you can't write about it when you're in it. You were having a profoundly transformative experience where you're. I mean, it's as big a change in life because you had your first baby. Like, I mean, you were going through that huge part of early marriage is hard. Mm-hmm. The first having babies is hard, and then you're doing it in this pressure cooker of a situation. when did you start to think like, oh, I want to write about this?
Yeah, that's a question. Definitely people.
Everyone wants to know.
Yeah, everyone wants to know. It's interesting. So I immediately started writing about the experience in the form of essays. And so I think that it was pretty immediate, and I didn't really think about, do I want to or do I not? But it was just sort of my way of making sense of it. And also, I remember writing something like, after 3 years, this life still feels brutally brand new. And I think it's taken me and kind of what I mean is that there are so many, like, it's a life defined by uncertainty. And so you're just constantly transitioning and shifting. And it's really taken me about 12 years now that it doesn't feel brutally brand new anymore, essentially. But I think I wrote to kind of deal with that feeling, like that kind of what is happening, like that head spinning feeling of adjusting, not just to the intensity of the lifestyle, but like, yeah, the culture shock and just an upending of really who I was. Like, I'd been an editor in New York, and now I was a wife. Like, a wife was really my most important identity in terms of my most visible identity in this world that I was part of. So I really, a couple agents reached out to me over the years when I was writing these essays, and they said, you should write a memoir about this. And I said, I can't. Like, it seemed like impossible to do because we were told to be silent. I was like, how can I do this? There's so much I can't share. There's so many privacy issues, and I care about those things. And there was that. And also, I think I was also very much in it. And so it wasn't until I moved to Washington and I had a baby, and she was 2.5 months old when we moved, and my husband continued to be gone, and I'd lost this community of women, that I really started to write about them, mostly because I missed them. And the responses I got to pieces I wrote about it was just like, I've never considered this experience. I've never thought about what you go through. I've never thought about like the joys of the friendships you guys have. And it had become so much like the air I breathed that I was kind of shocked to realize. I knew there was a military civilian divide, but I was kind of amazed to realize just how invisible we were. And so, they were the wives were like my access point into the story. But the more I wrote, the more I thought about this collective experience that is bigger, way bigger and longer than us, that is centuries old, really, and that has never really been given that much airtime. And that became, I guess, more and more important for me to tell my little fraction of that story.
Well, I wonder too about it. It seems to me like both in the writing of it, but then also in now publishing it and the reception of it, you have to be aware at all times of like, you're always writing for a double audience, right? And so to some extent you're writing, and everything you're saying, you're thinking, oh, well, how will liberals think about this? Like, how will Democrats think about this? How will Republicans think about this? How will, military people think about this? How will civilians think about this? How will religious people think about this? How will non-religious people think about this? And,
Totally.
you're kind of in between worlds trying to talk. And so what was that like? How did you have to consider that when you were writing it in the first place? Did you have to just ignore that and just pretend, or how do you write to a world that is so determined to like
be divided, to be polarized?
Yeah,
that was probably, I didn't realize it until you just articulated it like that, but I think that was the hardest part of writing this book, probably. And I sold the book on proposal, and I think that was helpful because I went through a process of some editors saying, oh, I love this, and then their publicity department saying, this is going to split the difference. Like, right-wing people aren't going to buy this book, left-wing people aren't going to buy this book. No, so it's just going to get lost. And or another publisher wanting it but saying, is it a blue book or is it a red book, like which one is it? And I was like, it's neither, it's for everybody, but it was like, it was so hard for some publishers to kind of conceive that it was neither. And so the publisher I did end up going with, whom has been incredible, they loved it because it was like ultimately about the power of human connection and shared humanity. And they believed that it could be a book for everybody. And so I think selling it on proposal was probably helpful in that I had that, like, their belief in it behind me. Like, I had my editor's belief in the power of that. And she truly believed in this book as a book for everybody. But yeah, after I finished the first, I was able to shut that out in the first draft. But when I was revising, I just kept saying, this is going to piss everybody off. Like, everybody's going to be mad. Nobody's going to like me after this. Like, I was so afraid, you know, of pissing off and alienating anybody, even though it's not like a reactionary, ragey book, I would say at the end of the day. It's still like we live in such a polarized world. And even, you know, and the military is not a monolith. So there's going to be soldiers and army spouses who read this who really feel seen by it. And there's going to be ones who are like, this is not a representation of my world and feel offended by it. And I think that's a weird, like, responsibility. I don't know if novelists have this, but I feel like memoirs have this weird responsibility to be almost like definitional about an experience. Like, this is what
the
like.
army a wife experience is, and it's only this. And you're like, well, no, this is just my life.
It's not, and that's one thing so I tried to take pains to show the military is not a monolith, and that this is like this one personal experience, but that people join for a million reasons, and being an officer, Air Force spouse is totally different than being, you know, who I am. But yeah, I mean, at the end of the day, I had to try to write to like stretch my compassion and try to write the people I was writing with as much, like, to tell the truth, but to also honor them simultaneously, which is a kind of challenging balance, and honor our experience. And then try really hard, like, despite it being called The Wives, to make it ultimately like a self-portrait. And that I, like, if anyone's on the hot seat other than the army, it's me. And I tried really hard to do that. So, but then, you know, people get mad at you for that too.
Well,
people just get mad at you.
I mean, I think, and partially
you
I'm
write a book.
asking because I feel like people are interested in this.
Yeah.
But, you know, what has the response been like? I mean, it had to have been terrifying showing Andrew. Like, at what point did he read?
He read, I think, my second draft, and he read 4 drafts, which is terrifying. Does that mean that I had 5 drafts? I don't know, but he read a lot of drafts, and we spent a lot of hours at our kitchen table after our kids went to bed talking about the book. And I had never been more nervous for somebody to read anything I'd written. We would go to bed, and it would be like his nighttime reading, and I'd be like, get out of here with this. Like, I can't, you cannot. And he would make a note, and I would just be like, what are you writing now? And he'd go, just let me read. I'm like, you can't do that in the same room or the same house. You might have to go get a hotel. You know, it was just like, I had so much anxiety about him reading it, because he's a really good reader. And he also knows the details of this world. And he's also really private. And he'd given me the support to write this really vulnerable, open story where, I mean, that's the thing about memoir. It's about you, but like, you intersect with other people's lives. But, you know, it ended up being a really pretty beautiful experience, because not only did he see, it's sort of like, I feel like with any marriage, right? It's like a union of 2 different lives. You're sharing the experience of building a life together, but the experience isn't the same. But I think sometimes you kind of forget that. But I also think that's the cause of a lot of friction in marriage, do you see me? Do you hear me? Do you understand, like, this experience? I do not have the same experience you had, even though we've been living in this house together. And I feel like that's exaggerated and intensified when one member of that marriage is deploying every year, and you're apart a lot. And
you're also being encouraged to not talk to each other about it.
To like not ask them questions. And the openness is not really encouraged. And so there was so much that he saw about my experience that he hadn't seen. And then also there was so much I understood that I hadn't about his experience, because he was forced to articulate things about why he joined that he never fully articulated. And also he has changed. Like, his feelings about being in the army now and deploying, now that we have a 5 and 7-year-old, are different than when he joined. And I knew that, but I didn't really understand like the depths of that. And he was forced to articulate that too. And so I think it was sort of like I think we can kind of like freeze our images of each other sometimes in marriage. And it was this like opportunity to get to know each other and to sort of like upend stale narratives that had kind of been I don't know. I'm thinking the word shackling, but that feels really extreme. But
Yeah,
you know,
that you get stuck inside of.
Yeah.
I also just think there's something remarkable about, I mean, we all have these interiorities that are so vast that, you know, I'm your like close friend and we're talking on the phone all throughout this period. And I still read this and was like, oh my God.
Right.
Like, I didn't know. I knew all this, but I didn't
know.
get it.
Yeah.
I didn't understand what it was like to live it.
Yeah.
And I think that there's something really profound and important about writing memoir because it's this chance to get to see a like consciousness and a lived experience that's not your own. So I've heard it said by memoirists that memoir is all about what you choose to leave out and not even about what you choose to put in, because theoretically you could probably write like, you know, a book this length all about just kindergarten. Like you could fill your whole life is way too much. You could write 20 books and still not fit everything in. And so I guess I was just curious if you, maybe that person was just trying to sound smart in a talk I watched, you know? Do you agree with that as a memoirist? And then also, what did you have to leave out?
Oh my God.
You know, I know that's like kind of a difficult question. And
no,
I don't just
understand.
Me. I'm not really in the book.
I had to cut her.
No.
I had to cut her. She was like,
I was tangential. I wasn't really
she was
part
there.
of this
it just didn't. There were two.
The next one's about the friendship.
Essentially, my editor was just like, there are too many women. I can't keep track. So, yeah. But yeah,
got the axe.
Which is one answer to your question. It's like I had to cut out women I really adored who just didn't like
serve a plot function.
Yeah, basically. And you know, that's another thing you do with scenes. It's like sometimes there are 10 people there at like the book club, but really it might make sense to have like 7 people. Like, this is something you put in your author's notes. Like I omitted people when it didn't really. Maybe they were there for 5 minutes and then left, you know, that kind of thing. And so there is an element to memoir that is kind of like writing fiction, except you're like just cutting people. It's like cutting them out of a magazine. I don't know. It's a weird thing for sure. I mean, there are certain decisions I made, like I did not make any composite characters. I did, there's nothing actually fictional in the book. But also you have to figure out, originally I remember a friend of mine being like, oh, you should write about like your time in New York and then moving to Georgia and then moving to Washington, having kids. And, and you could do that. But I was like,
or even just like the length of the birth scene. I was like, this could have been 40 pages.
Yes. The birth scene was like, exactly.
It's like, okay, we don't have time to get into this.
So we're going to speed this along. And a lot of that for me was just overwriting. Like I had 50,000 words I threw out. And a lot of that was just reading it all as a piece and realizing like, we don't really need this. And I'd been an editor for a long time, which was probably helpful because I think I was able to look at my writing more as an editor than
that was
I
one of
my
questions actually.
Yeah.
For a little, but how do you think your work as an editor has influenced yourself as a writer? Are there any like big craft lessons that you took away from your years as an editor that
that it's okay to throw out 50,000 words, like that is not, doesn't make you a freak or a weirdo. Yes, that is not a sign of failure. That first drafts are generally pretty terrible, and you just have to give yourself permission to write a terrible first draft, which is really, really hard. I was much better giving my authors that permission than giving myself that permission. And then I think beyond that, I learned a ton about structure, which I think was really important to me writing this book, because a lot of memoirs can kind of suffer from like a lack of very much, like they just sort of use what happened as the structure. But if you want something to be engaging and readable and tightly paced and have a little bit of suspense, and which all those things, especially as I get older and have kids, like if I don't want to know what happens next, I will not keep reading a book. Like I just don't have the time. So like that was really top of mind for me. And that meant like, yeah, okay, this is a cool scene. This is interesting. It tells you something about this character, but it's kind of dragging. It's not really doing anything to contribute to like the character arc and this, that kind of thing. So I do think structurally editing helped a lot. Like my experience with editing helped a lot.
My other question is, so you came from a journalism background and then kind of found a place for yourself in the publishing world as an essayist, writing these personal essays.
Mhm.
But this is your first long form project.
Mhm.
How do you feel about long form versus short form? What can you do in long form? Like, what parts of it surprised you? What parts of it were really hard? Do you want to write more long form stuff, or are you like, bring back my
Bring back my
peaceful-
little essays.
Yes.
It's funny. I remember you saying when you started writing novels that you're like, oh, this.
Oh, thank God. Yeah.
Yeah,
I needed
because
it.
and short stories had always been challenging. And then
Yes.
once you had like the space, it was almost like you could breathe and you felt free. And I was like, really? Like it just seems so daunting to me. But I totally see what you mean now. And I wrote an essay recently and I was proud of that essay. I hadn't written an essay, a short thing in a while, but it made me realize like writing short is really hard.
Yeah.
I mean, it's really, really hard to not have a lot of space. And before all this, like back, I was once a poet. And that's like and I think I
Yeah.
stopped because it was too hard. Like, I mean, the challenge of writing like a really good poem is, I mean, you got to write a lot of really bad poems to get to a good poem, I feel like. And so I think I found it freeing eventually. But in the beginning, I remember feeling like, I can't do this. And I'm now, have a novel percolating that I'm starting. And I just feel like, I don't know how to do it. I don't feel like I did that. Like, and I've heard that a lot of authors feel that way. Like every time they start a new book, they're like, I don't know how to write a book. What am I doing?
How do I do this again?
And I feel a little bit that way right now. But I do remember being like in the trenches of this book, deep in it, and just being like, I get to do this. This is so fun. And and even though it's about my life and I'm, even though there are hard things I was writing about, it was like such a joy and such like a safe place I could go when things were really hard in my daily life. And I don't think essays give that to you in the same way. I think essays are beautiful things for distilling like insight for me. They help me really make sense of what I'm experiencing in the very recent past. But like you said, I could have never written a book about what I was going through in Georgia. Like the essays I could do because it's almost like catching this like butterfly of insight and pinning it down and then just like looking at all the colors in its wings. I know I'm getting weird with my metaphor here, but it's more like attainable to do. It does. I don't know. Essays feel like capturing something fleeting. And books feel like, or at least this book, at least a memoir, it felt like I had to have like geographical distance at the very least to even write about Georgia. If that makes sense.
I experience writing long form as like building really rad underground tunnels. Like it has a like you're building a space, you're building a world, and then you're just in there and you're constantly like fixing up your fort.
I think we're showing people how weird we are.
That's true.
Now.
Okay, that's fine.
I think.
But
writing is weird like that. It is. I think that's what I mean by safe space. It's like it does feel like you're going
like,
somewhere.
Ooh, I'm going in my little world.
No one
now.
else gets to go, but in a good way. It's like a den you make when you're a little kid in your closet. And
Exactly.
Nobody knows about my secret space.
Yeah.
That's kind of what writing is like, which is the ultimate.
Well, so this is leading into I've got process questions. So, okay, are you a person who likes drafting more or revision more?
Revision. Drafting's horrible. I mean, which is so funny. There's a quote, I forget whose quote it is, but it is the only joy in life is to begin.
Yeah, that's insane.
Do you know his name? You used to love him.
I'm sure I did, but I don't
He's
know
like Czech or Hungarian. How do you say his Milaus?
Czesław Miłosz?
Thank you. That's him. So I was like, I don't know. I'm going to butcher that. He said the only joy in life is to begin, which is a beautiful idea that I do not.
And he's a poet.
I do not understand, but maybe for poetry. No, it's like the blank page is horrible, and I'm frequently filled with self-doubt as I'm drafting, especially with memoir. What I did struggle with for years before actually writing one was like, why would anyone want to hear about my life? And I think every memoirist probably feels that way, unless they've really had like, I don't know, a Tara Westover kind of life or something. It feels like you don't need my story. And so I feel very plagued with self-doubt when I'm doing that. When I'm revising, that to me feels like what writing actually is. I know that sounds bizarre, but it doesn't feel like revision. It feels like, oh, this is the writing. Because it's almost like you have the materials And
I wonder if maybe that's part of your editorial self. You get to be your editorial self. And then you're like,
yeah.
oh, but now I have carte blanche. I can just move stuff around the way I want it to be.
And then you feel kind of powerful and you're like, I can just slash this and I can just move this. And I can just change this whole timeline because, like, that was another thing. I would like get timelines radically
I was
wrong.
wondering, like, did you find the fallibility of memory?
I had to redraft the first 12 chapters because I got some major like timeline points not correct because I was so, in the beginning, it's so like you just have to get words down.
Yeah.
And so I was just like, I'm just gonna, kind of look at some source material, like look at emails, look at some of my journals, but not really get in the weeds.
Just write it the way you remember it.
Yes. And then I got to like chapter 12 and I was like, no, I've gotten some things fundamentally wrong. And and it was really, really looking through all of like journals and emails and Facebook posts to realize I'd gotten some things. And that really required changing big pieces of the book, which was hard and made me want to write fiction.
Yeah.
Because then you can really be God.
Be like, no, it happened.
Then you can, yeah, exactly. Then you can do whatever you want, which must be great. And also totally daunting because it's like
too many options.
Yeah. How do you, I know you're the one asking the questions, but like, how do you do that?
I don't know. It's like you kind of make a couple decisions and then
they get like more narrow. Yeah. I got
it. But okay. How did writing the book change your understanding of like yourself, but also like this period in your life? Like I imagine that writing about and turning yourself into a character involves seeing yourself in a new way and understanding new things about yourself.
I think that I understood better that when I got to Georgia, I was not a very open person. And I didn't understand. I had never understood. I didn't know how to ask for help. I didn't know how to rely on other people. I had always kind of I'd left home at 17 and been on my own. And I didn't, and I thought that made me tough or made me independent. And then I was suddenly in a world where I was absolutely screwed if I didn't ask for help and rely on other people. And I wasn't tough and independent. I was desperately in need of support. So that, I just realized that changed me fundamentally in a way, I think, where now, in Washington, I feel like I've been like very deliberate about building a community both for myself and my kids. And really trying to like through example show them that like having a village and having people who rely on you and you rely on like is incredibly important and you will not get through life without it. And I don't think I'd be that kind of mom. I don't think I'd be that kind of person now without that experience. I also have a lot more compassion for both myself and him and also everyone in the book, like even people at the time I really disliked or had friction with. Like I think that we were all young. Some people were very young and had multiple children and no family support and were making very little money. And we're not given like any kind of guidebook or pamphlet on what to do and like how to do this life. You're just thrown into it and you like the army tells you what to do and you do it. And so there were ways that he fumbled that I think certain readers could see and be like, oh, this guy's insufferable or he's an ass. And, and there are certain ways I fumbled that they'd be like, ugh, this woman is a snob or, but when I read it now, I just am like, these are just young people trying to figure it out. And so I think writing that gave me more compassion and more empathy for him. Like it made me understand how hard he was trying and like what a hard place he was in.
I'm tearing up. Okay, I know I'll open it up to questions. I just two more. I feel, at least in my books, I always have a favorite scene, like one that I'm like, oh, that one came out good, and or like that it surprised you, or like, so do you have a favorite scene in this book that was just fun to write? Like maybe not even like, oh, I think it works better than the others, or it was like my best work or something, but like that you had the most fun writing.
My best work. I love it. There's a scene. Well, okay. I would say the fun one probably was the army ball scene. We went to his unit's ball and they do this weird thing where they make the grog and they mix, liquors and sand, and sometimes they put a fake snake in there, and they put Gatorade and absinthe, and I mean,
but it's each one thing is to like represent a different thing, and then but you keep telling
it's disgusting. There was one reason where Andrew was part of the ceremony. He had to drink you have to down a thing of goat milk and then put the rest in. And anyway, it's very gross. And it was very cultish. And I joked in the scene, like, is this where we find out we're joined a cult? And everyone represents like a conflict that the unit's been in, and it goes way back. So it's funny and strange and weird, but it's like I'm also really taken with it. Like there's this kind of beauty to the whole ceremony, and I finally like really understand what Andrew says when he's like, this is bigger than me. This is history. This is like I belong to something that's so much bigger than either one of us. And it's just a fun scene with the other couples in it. And I had fun writing that scene.
I love the scene.
I think another scene I'm attached to, and it might even be in part because you really loved this scene too, was when Rachel comes over, and it's kind of like that look in the mirror moment in the middle of a book where you're sort of like, how have I gotten here? And what am I going to do to like rebuild? Like where I was sort of just felt like I'd lost myself. And, the ending of that scene is really about, I think I say something like, how did I get here? And she's like, I wonder that myself all the time. And the ending's really about this, people would ask us like, well, people can be very hard on Army spouses and say, you know what you signed up for. And like, newsflash, this is like, duh. And it's like, no, we don't. Nobody knows what they said. No one knows what they signed up for. Like when you have a child, you don't really know. You can watch other people, but you don't know until you have that child. And so I feel an attachment to that scene because I think that sentiment of like, no one knows what they sign up for. And also just that like, we were speaking, but there was like kind of this unspoken communion. I think a lot of the closeness I had with those women were unspoken moments like that, of like kind of seeing each other, but not really commenting on it and feeling just less alone because of that.
Okay. And then this is kind of a weird one to end on. And yet I feel
What's
like it's
next?
important. For you, I know next you're going to write a novel, but like you've been a poet, you're a fiction writer, you're a memoirist, you're an essayist,
I know,
you're
what's
a journalist.
my problem? I'm a little
No, you're experiencing the world. But I want to know who are like the writers that are the biggest influence on you. And so you can answer in terms of like it could be fiction writers, it could be memoirists, it doesn't matter. But like who are the writers that like went into the
making of this book?
The making of this book, but maybe also just the making of you.
Yeah. Oh gosh, wow. Well, I'll start with something easy. Thinking about structure and pacing and all that, I listened to a lot of thrillers when I wrote this book, which this book is not a thriller, but I'm so in awe of thriller writers, like good ones, because I literally, like when I'm listening to a thriller, I can't stop. I will deep clean my house for 5 hours. And like, I want that power as a writer. I think that's like the most amazing power, to get somebody to just like cancel plans so they can listen to the rest of your story. And so like Ruth Ware, a thriller writer I adore, is a big influence on me. Cheryl Strayed, like I think that was the first memoir, Vile, that I read, where it kind of just gave me permission, because she was so vulnerable and so honest, but also it was just like this beautiful human universal story that I could deeply relate to. And it made me understand that memoir is like, in some ways, like despite all that self-doubt about it being navel gazing, I think at the end of the day, memoir is it's like in some ways the most generous offering of any kind of writing. And I really felt like I got that from that book. And then, gosh, there's just so many books from when we were in college. And
I always think about Willa Cather with you.
Yes, Willa Cather. Yes. I mean, Willa Cather, who wrote My Antonia, she was contemporaries with Hemingway, and Gertrude Stein introduced them. This is lore, but she introduced them, and he wouldn't shake her hand because Gertrude Stein said, this is the other like,
this is the best male American
yeah,
writer.
there's
meet
the best
female
woman,
American
and he
writer,
just
and
was
he
said,
was like,
that's not no such thing.
piss right off.
But yeah, I think that it was what you were saying actually at lunch, where somebody was complaining about a book being sentimental, and you said sentiment is not sentimentality. And I think Willa Cather really taught me that. Like, her books are so moving, and there's like an earnestness in them. And the relationships dynamics are so important to them. But they're not sentimental.
Mhm.
And so I think there's definitely, I feel like I probably have some of her in my DNA. Yeah.
Yes. I feel like
Thank you for
were
thinking of
alike.
her. There's so much stuff that it's like, I would have to almost just look at my library to really.
Oh, totally. No, it's an impossible question.
That's a good
But-
question.
Well, I feel like, because I feel like we're.
I know, we're probably, I think we're hitting that time.
Yeah, but so would you guys have any questions, or? I asked them all.
Or did she ask all of them? I know.
I have one.
Oh, sure.
The opening, was that always the opening? Did you rewrite the beginning
Yes.
times, and like how did you choose?
I mean, no, it wasn't always.
this one? And I know it like flashes back to talking about the decision and the statement about choosing between the army and you. Like, how did you decide to include that so early in the
Right.
story?
The opening was really hard. When I started on proposal, you have to include the first chapter, and I started with the morning he was deploying 2 weeks later. Originally, that whole first chapter, and I ended up scrapping that, and then I started one where it started in New York before we had moved, and then I scrapped that chapter. And I mean, that one had us. We were hanging out at the motel overnight. I mean, there was like all these. When I say 50,000 words, I'm not exaggerating. And then I finally was like, oh, I should start with the house. I don't know. I think it was just like the image that finally came to me, and also just the very fact. I know, and the very
linked together. They're pink windows.
I think just the very fact too that like Rachel showed up that day, and it was, I realized this book is. I mean, the book is the wives. The wife needs to like be there on page. Another wife needs to be there page 2, or people are going to be like, why am I reading this? I mean, it seemed really important. And then, the backstory being in there in the first chapter, I just thought that was a hard decision, but I just thought people are not going. For me, it's like I really need to know a little bit, not in those first scenes. Like I want to get hooked, but then I have to get to be invested in the storyline going forward. I need to know how they got there, and I need to know who these characters are a little bit, and that allowed me to develop Andrew a little bit and develop myself as a character as well. And I think it showed just sort of the shock of the situation. So that's how I made that decision. It's a good question. You guys have been an awesome audience. Thank you.
Yeah, I'd like to know, the first 10 years of your marriage when you had children, did you have an outside job other than taking care of your children and writing? Because I just found being married to someone in the military, that was kind of frowned upon.
That's interesting. Not when I had a kid. I was working and I'm like teaching an after school program, which when I was pregnant, which didn't even get to make it in the book. Unfortunately, there was another whole chapter that had to get scrapped. But when I moved to Washington, I was a stay-at-home mom who was trying to write, and then I started an editing business, and that was my job.
Mm-hmm.
But it was something I could do from home because I couldn't. I mean, when I left my job as an editor in New York, I think that the world has changed a lot in the last 10 years. I just mean in terms of the ability to work from
remotely,
home.
Yeah.
So I think that has afforded certain like me opportunities and other wives opportunities that we wouldn't have had. And especially some spouses in my husband's unit, they don't move very much, so I don't have to contend with that. But I know women are moving every 2 years, and especially if they have jobs like physical therapists, we have to get licensed in each state.
Mm-hmm.
It's like I see a lot of people give up their careers. Yeah, absolutely, because it's so much work, and and especially I think I don't have this just for responsibility, but high-ranking officer wives are kind of like the mayor's wife. So there's all these sort of unwritten expectations of things, and of gatherings you have to run and fundraisers. And thank God I don't have to do that because I don't know how most of them don't have outside careers. That's true.
You don't have much of a life really,
Except your children. Yeah. And I mean, it's the last 7 years. Exactly. The last 7 years, I say, like, I've been chained to my house. It's kind of true. And, yes. And, he deployed during lockdown and during COVID. And that was just me and a 2-year-old and a 3-year-old at home. And like, I had to stop my editing business. I had to just say, I'm not working. And, you are secondary in many ways. It's very true.
And
like your needs are secondary.
Really tells you that I don't care what you say. You're never prepared for something like that.
Exactly. Right. Yeah.
I forget if I know this already, but did you record the audiobook? And if so, how was that?
I did. Originally, they were going to have an actor. Sorry? Oh my God, Randy? Oh my God. This is the audiobook producer. Oh. It's so funny. Like, you just look different and like you are more petite. I didn't, you were always very like mighty on the screen. And yeah, no. Oh yeah. We had a good and weird time together.
She's a great reader.
Oh, that's so sweet. Yeah. She's a freaking great producer. I had no idea what I was doing. And we were in this little studio. Can I tell this?
Oh, please.
Yeah. So this studio. So first they were like, you got to go to Seattle. And I was like, I can't get to Seattle. I mean, I can, but I'm going to have an hour and a half to record and have to get back to pick up my kids. Like, it's not going to happen. So then they're like, we can't find a studio in Tacoma. And eventually they found this one in this little town outside of Base that was really like a hip hop studio run by this 27-year-old engineer who wore like red velour, like sweatsuits. Matt, I mean, he was amazing. He did a good job, but he was used to like coming in at 9 at night and working until 2 a.m. with like guys doing hip hop, and then this like suburban mom walks in.
She reads off an iPad, and they didn't have a stand for it.
They didn't have any. No, they didn't even have an iPad at first. We just had like a
He didn't even have an iPad.
glorified phone that I was reading off of.
They thought she was going to hold it up for 6 hours.
Yeah, and Randy's like, this is not gonna work. You were so like even keel, but things were just like constantly falling apart in the beginning and really throughout. And it was marathon because they had to get an advance copy, and so it was like, it was a little bit of a boot camp for me. So there were a couple of days I read a lot. I don't know, like 90 pages one day. I know it's long. It was really, Randy really helped me let go of perfectionism because I remember in the beginning, she was like, yeah, we're never going to finish this if you keep, saying this sentence again. And that, as a writer, that's like a challenge for me. I get very perfectionistic, and it was totally freeing to just be like, well, I'm just doing this. And it's kind of like journalism. It was like, I'm on a deadline, like just gotta, whatever comes out. And I had to really, I knew that she was a great producer, and she told me the editor was really great. And I just was like, I'm just going to lean into that and hope that Matt doesn't completely like screw this. He'd never done an audiobook before. So that was also totally new to him. It was also really, I'm not sure. Yeah. But it was also like really beautiful though, because there were moments when, there were like intimate passages I read where I felt both of you listening, not just professionally, but as readers. And that felt really special. I hadn't had that experience with the book with anybody before. So it felt like I felt more, I felt like we connected because of that.
And it's a really wonderful audiobook.
Thank you. Yeah, I'm really glad I got to do it. It was really exhausting, and I have a lot of respect for voice actors because it's hard work. Definitely. Like the last day I actually fell down my friend's stairs afterwards. Like I went because I was dizzy from like reading so many words, and I think maybe hadn't slept very much. And there's a lot of reasons I fell. I was fine, but I just mean it's like it's physically taxing in a way that I hadn't really thought about before I did it. It was a really cool experience. I feel very lucky to have gotten to do it. Does anyone else have any questions?
Yeah, if I could throw one out. I know you're not the
You look kind of
spokesperson
familiar.
Do I?
Yeah.
Oh, I don't know.
Okay. No.
Am I in the book?
No,
Sorry.
I think you just have a warm face. You just-
Well, I was brought up by a military wife, so maybe that's
Oh.
Somebody who your father is. We'll get to that later, my friends. Immaterial at this point. But I know you're not the spokesperson for military wives, but do you think you have a thought that you could stay out there, stay out there for past, present, and future military wives, kind of like what you've learned through your experience from this?
Oh.
I know it's heavy, but
Yeah, that is heavy. I think one thing I have learned that is, that I was kind of speaking to before is just that more often than not, welcome people over your threshold. And like more often than not, people will surprise you. When I say threshold, I mean like welcome them into your house. I think that there's sort of like we live in this, we're in like what has been called an epidemic of loneliness. The Surgeon General said like, this is a health problem. We are so lonely. And yet somebody knocks on our door. We're like, why is there somebody knocking on my door? And I think, or, there's a number, call it. I don't know that number. I'm not picking that up. We've become averse to kind of the unknown. And yet I think we have to be open to it in order to make those connections. And that also like, there's a lot when an anchor in your family leaves, like your husband, there's a loss, but that opens up this space for other relationships. And like a lot of people love my kids, and then that would probably happen anyway, but it feels like even more because he's gone a lot. And so people step in and they're not fulfilling the role of dad, but they're fulfilling a role of just like a member of our community,
Uncles and aunties, and
who loves my kids,
yeah.
And so there are opportunities, but also like, complain about the things that are not okay. Like there should be more childcare. There should be like the childcare options are awful. They're pretty much non-existent. And we're really discouraged to complain about such things. But I think if more of us like rose up and got pissed off about untenable situations that we're sometimes put in, change might happen.
great.
Yeah.
Hell
Thank
yeah.
you. Thank you. This is so lovely. And yeah, I'll sign books for whoever wants a signature. Is there a good place I should sit to do that? Is it here fine? Okay. You can come to me. I feel like I'm on a throne right now.